What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are doing another top 10 decks of the week. That's right, 2 in the same week. And why would we be doing that? It's because we are doing the top 10 decks of NOEX, the NOEX format. And for those who don't know what that is, it was basically like a fan-made format where what you do is you go into private match and you type in all caps NOEX, NOEX, and you play NOEX Pokemon, and it's a pretty popular format. In fact, they have tournaments for it. And just in case you didn't know, all these tournaments are played on Play TCG Limitless, and on that website, and I'm going to show you, in fact I'll show you right now how to get into a NOEX format. So here we are on the Play Limitless TCG.com, and on here, this is where you go and you play all the tournaments that you would want to play for Pokemon Pocket. But usually when you're playing in a tournament or you're signing up, you only have the option to sign up for the standard format. But now on Play Limitless TCG, they have the ability to sign up directly into NOEX tournaments. In fact, they've gone so far as to be able to split the decks and the tournament results separate from the standard format. So for instance, here we can click on decks, and then as we're over here, you click the game you want to look into, Pokemon TCG Pocket, and then down here is all the decks for the standard format. And then as you can see, it also shows specifically Mythical Island. You can click on it and you can look at even the decks that were their win rates and meta shares from the Genetic Apex portion of the meta. But then once Mythical Island came out, this is the current set that we have in standard, so that's what we're looking at. But now when you click on format, you actually have the NOEX. So you can click on the NOEX, and as you can see, you have all these NOEX decks, all their meta shares, and all of their win rates. So that is pretty cool, which means they now officially have data for the NOEX format. So now what I'm going to do is, going forward, I'm going to be trying to cover both the standard and NOEX format, coming out with meta reports and top 10 decks of the week for both the standard format and the NOEX, since they have separated the data into its own data pool and is easily grabbable, and I can cover this for content for my viewers. And so with that being said, let's get into the first deck. So this is the first deck, and it's a Florges Psychic Toolbox deck, and I love this deck. This deck is really, really cool. And so I just want to say at the beginning, this has a little bit of an asterisk in it. I do believe the 10th best deck in the game can be like a handful of decks. I chose this one specifically because it won a tournament, whereas a lot of the other ones with better win rates did not. And I also tried not to look at decks that had a less than 1% meta share. However, this one did win a tournament, so I did choose it. And this one on the screen is actually the one that won a tournament. And that specific version of the deck has about a 61% win rate. However, the meta share is like 0.14. So it's not a lot of people playing the deck. In fact, I think it was only brought into like 3 different tournaments, to be honest. And so I don't think that it's being played enough to represent that huge meta share. However, the version with 2 Jinx has been played quite a bit, but that only has around a 49%. So I kind of just offset it and gave it a 50% win rate. I kind of mocked that up a little bit myself, but because it did get this version has like a 60% win rate, it did win a tournament, I did decide to choose this deck as the 10th best deck in the NOEX format. And it's really the only viable deck that I've seen in the NOEX format that runs the mythical slab and does very well when it does. So the 2 Florges, for those that don't know, very similar to the Butterfree. It's a stage 2 Pokemon that once online, it has the ability to be able to heal 20 damage from each of your Pokemon. Now, unlike Butterfree, who has the ability to do that, the Florges has to do it by attacking. So it's once it attacks, it does 80 damage for 2 psychic energy, which is pretty decent, even though it's a stage 2. It is a single price Pokemon, so that is pretty strong. It's actually stronger than the Beedrill for just 1 energy, so I kind of like that as well, because 2 energy on a stage 2 is not hard to get to. And then it heals 20 damage from each of your Pokemon, so that is very good, and it's very strong in a format that might not be doing a ton of damage output, because obviously the EX Pokemon are usually the Pokemon doing the massive amounts of damage. And then you're also playing 2 Potion alongside the Florges to continue to be able to heal as much as possible. Now, the other cool thing about this deck, of course, is the ability to be able to play Mythical Slab. So the professors researched the Pokeball and Mythical Slab alongside something like this one of Sigilyph allows you to just turbo through your deck like crazy to be able to get into that Florges as soon as possible. And I love those 4 cards comboed in a deck together. I think it's a tremendous package to have in a Psychic deck. That package is played in many Mewtwo Gardevoir decks as well, and it's because it's super duper quick to get into whatever you need to. And then you have the Kangaskhan. Yes, there's a Kangaskhan in this deck, and this is very good too, because it's one of the better tanks in the game that you can play energy on and do a ton of potential chip damage. So of course the damage is already good, but really the cool thing is the tanking, because you are playing stage 2 Pokemon. You want to be able to tank and buy some time if you don't have the Sigilyph in the front to be able to get into that Florges. And then you have the Jinx, and Jinx is just as beneficial in this format as it is standard, because there are still a ton of decks that run tons of energy. Dragonite, Golem, Exeggutor from Mythical Island, a ton of decks playing like 4 energy on their Pokemon, allowing Jinx to get a tremendous amount of value. And then we're playing 2 Sabrina, which is always super good. To be able to play 2 Sabrina in any deck is super good. But we are playing also 1 Giovanni, and I'm not so sure about the Giovanni. I honestly think this should be replaced with at least a 1 copy of a Leaf, because the Kangaskhan has 1 energy requirement to attack, but it has 3 to retreat, and you don't play any X-Speeds or any Leaf in this deck at all, which is super confusing, because basically what you've said is once my Kangaskhan is out there, I'm okay with it getting knocked out. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. So I would definitely change the Giovanni for a Leaf. I don't think you're finding very many breakpoints in this format with the amount of damage this deck is outputting, to be completely honest. But I could also be wrong. But I would definitely be putting the Leaf in over the Kangaskhan. I would also be, and if not, I would be changing the Kangaskhan for another Psychic Pokemon, or potentially changing both of these things for either 1 Psychic and 1 Blue. And why the Blue? The Blue because of the Florges 120 HP. It doesn't matter how much you heal. If you get hit for 120 or more, you're just getting knocked out. There aren't many Pokemon in the game for NOEX that can do that, but there are a couple who can. For instance, Golem, one of the strongest cards in the game, does 120 exactly. You want to be able to do play a Blue to stop that from happening. Same thing with Melmetal, does 120. Same thing with Flareon, does 110, plus a Giovanni is 120. So I just think this deck would benefit more from a Blue than it would a Giovanni, or a Leaf over the Giovanni for the Kangaskhan, or another Psychic Pokemon altogether that doesn't need a high retreat cost. But with that being said, let's get into the 9th best deck of NOEX. So this is the next deck, and it's the Greninja Techbox deck, or at least that's what I call it, Greninja Techbox. And this is a super duper common deck in standard format, but it's even better in NOEX. In the standard format, it's running a 54% win rate. However, in NOEX, it's running a 2% meta share and a 60% win rate. This deck is super duper successful. So in fact, it's honestly just like standard format, has like the highest win rate for a deck that has a decent meta share in the entire NOEX format. And the funny thing is, you might be asking yourself, well, then why have you placed it as the 9th best deck? Because all other decks have a lower win rate than this. It's because it still has yet to win a tournament. And so I decided to put it in as the 9th best deck out of the top 10, even though it has a humongous win rate. And this deck, let's get into the deck, is the 2 Greninja lines, the 2 Marshadow, 2 Hitmonlee, and 2 Farfetch. This deck is super duper good. It's very aggressive at the beginning of the game, and you're able to attack in with things like Farfetch, and even if it gets knocked out, you bring in that Marshadow and hit for 100 damage, which means you have just done, over the course of minimum 2 turns, 140 damage, and 140 damage in a NOEX format is absolutely huge. And then when you pair it with Greninja, that's 160. If you happen to get 2 shots off with Farfetch, that's 180. So this deck is very good and allows you to be able to target a ton of different Pokemon and knock almost anything out. But the one thing I will say is I don't think Hitmonlee, especially at 2 copies, is as beneficial in this format as it is standard. We're not going to be seeing a lot of Magikarp, so I don't expect there to be a ton of one-shot sniping going on with the Hitmonlee. But nevertheless, this deck did play, or does often play, 2 Hitmonlee. I think I would prefer to probably take out 1 Hitmonlee and maybe add something like a second Giovanni or a second Sabrina. Those having 2 Sabrina in your deck, I honestly think if you're playing the type of deck where you can fit 2 Sabrina in, you should always be playing 2 Sabrina. Like, that's where the conclusion that I've come to more often than not. I used to always be on 2 Sabrina, then I decided I think 1's good enough, but now I'm honestly back on the 2 Sabrina train, especially if you can fit it. And in this deck, when you're trying to be pretty aggressive in the early game, I think having 2 Giovannis is super duper good. And so I definitely would be trying to fit in a second Giovanni in this deck and possibly removing a Hitmonlee, but they are playing 2. But anyways, let's get into deck number 8. So this is the 8th best deck that I chose, and I believe is the 8th best deck in NOEX. It's the Dragon deck, or Dragon Knight deck, because it's playing Dragonite and Druddigon. And this deck has been played before in standard format, but it does way better in NOEX. It's currently a 3% meta share and runs about a 50% win rate, and it has gone all the way to a tournament final and has won a single tournament, at least from the tournaments that I'm able to see through the data that PTCG or Play TCG Limitless provides. And this deck runs 2 Dragonite and 2 Druddigon, the only Dragon type Pokemon that we have currently in the game. It's obviously running 2 Professor's Research and 2 Pokeball and 2 Sabrina. We just talked about how I like to see 2 Sabrina in decks when I can. However, this is the one deck I don't actually like. I would be okay with playing no Sabrina in this deck because, for one, you're probably not attacking with your Druddigon anyways. I definitely don't think you'd be playing 3 different energies, so you're probably just playing the water and the electric, and it doesn't really matter which one you attack into to the active. You're trying to do a ton of spread damage to win the game in about 2 turns. Now, with that being said, Sabrina still works good in the deck. It can slow your opponent down. You do need a lot of stall components in this deck. You have things like Druddigon to tank. You have Sabrina to be able to potentially get something too strong out of the active. You also have potions to keep your guys online to continue to stall out the game. And you also have a red card. That's right, this deck is playing a red card. And I kind of like red card in Dragonite decks because you do want a lot of stall components, because there can be a lot of times where, one, either you don't have the evolution stage in time or you don't have the right energy in time. So you need to be able to stall the game out as long as possible, more in this deck than any other deck. But then we're also playing 1 leaf and 2 X speed. And I think I've been seeing this ratio a lot more lately, and I kind of starting to come around to it a little bit more. And I think it's because I always, any Druddigon deck, I'm always like, you gotta play 2 leaf. You gotta play 2 leaf. You gotta be able to get that Druddigon out there and bring in that Dragonite as soon as possible. But I think it's actually more important to get Druddigon into the active when he's not there at the beginning of the game than it is to get him out later on. Because one, again, it could be knocked out and then you just get to bring your own guy in anyways, or because by the time you're ready to take him out, you might get that leaf in hand anyways, whereas you want to see the X speed more often at the beginning of the game than you do the leaf to be able to get the Druddigon in. So I do like the 2x speed and the 1 leaf ratio in this deck. But with that being said, let's get in to the 7th best deck in the game. So this is the next deck, and it's a Melmetal deck. And in fact, there's 2 decks here on screen, and there's a couple of decks you're going to see with multiple decks on the screen for them. This is the first of them, and the 1% meta share, the 50% win rate, and the 1 win in tournament, it goes to the one on the top, the first deck with just the Melmetals, the Druddigons, and the Kangaskhan. And the reason I actually put this second one here with Greninja is, even though this version, the Greninja deck, has only around like a 40, I think 7 to 48% win rate, so it's much lower. The reason I put it up here is because I'm actually kind of surprised that it's not as good or even better than the better playing version of the deck, the one on top, because Melmetal with 120 and then mixed with Druddigon and Greninja, that package, it feels super duper reminiscent to the Gyarados EX version of it in standard, and it's also very similar to the Flareon build that we're going to be looking at a little bit later. So I am kind of shocked that it doesn't do as well as the version without Greninja, especially since Greninja is played in so many different decks to help it out, that this one you would think it would help it out even more. However, it seems like that one has a much lower win rate, and so the best version of this deck again is the Melmetal Druddigon version without Greninja. So let's talk about that one. It's playing 2 Melmetal, 2 Druddigon, and 1 Kangaskhan. So yes, this deck is relying heavily on a ton of tanks in the front, like Druddigon and Kangaskhan. You're playing 3 total tanks, or even 4 or 5 if you consider the first Melmetal as being a tank while you build up a second one in the back. And so this deck is obviously going to be playing Leafs, as you can see, because those Pokemon in the front you need to be able to get out when you want that Melmetal in, and you're also playing 2 X speed as well, so a lot of free retreating going on so you can get things in and out when you absolutely need to. This deck is also playing 2 Giovanni, and why? Because it's not playing Greninja. So maybe it is just better. Maybe the breakpoints in NOEX are just easier to hit with a single Giovanni over trying to waste space and build up to a Greninja. And then, of course, the 2 Professors Research and 2 Pokeball. In fact, for the rest of this video, I'm not even going to mention those 2 cards because they're not necessary. They're in every single deck. But the one card I will mention that's not in this deck is Sabrina. Wow, that is kind of shocking. No Sabrina. And you would think a deck like this would potentially want to do that, but it does not. And instead, what we're doing is we're playing things, like blue, and blue is for sure to be able to keep that Melmetal online, or even that Druddigon to get it an extra turn of free value, getting 20 extra damage on your opponent's side of the board. And Melmetal is super duper strong. 120 with Druddigon, again, That's already 140 damage with Giovanni. That's 150. 150. That's knocking out a ton of Pokemon. However, it's also not knocking out Golem, which is why, again, I'm surprised that the Greninja decks aren't doing better with Melmetal. This deck is also playing things like potions. So potions and blue in this deck are really, really valuable because, for one, it allows you to keep your Druddigon on for extra turns if you need, and it also allows you to keep the Melmetal in place since it is really your only attacker in the deck. And one thing that this deck does really well is against other decks that play Druddigon, because the Melmetal, it's pre-evolution, the basic. I can't think of its name, and I can't really see the card on my screen, to be honest. What it does, it allows you to, when you attack, to wrap another metal energy onto it. So when you're playing Druddigon decks, it's super duper good because, one, you get to attack. Because it doesn't do any damage, you don't take any damage from the Druddigon that's in your opponent's active Pokemon, your active spot, sorry. And so then you can just sit there while the opponent's Druddigon does no damage to you, while you just ramp energy onto it and then evolve it into the Melmetal. So this deck is a very good deck, and I did believe it to be the 7th best deck out of all decks that I was looking at in the NOEX format. And with that being said, let's get into what I believe is the 6th best deck in NOEX. So this is the next deck, and it's Blaine. That's right, the Blaine decks are very good in NOEX, and this should be no surprise. In fact, I expected it before I started looking at the data. I expected Blaine to be like one of the top 3 decks. However, I came to the conclusion that I don't believe that that is the case, even though this deck does have a 10% meta share. That's right. That's why we're putting 3 different versions up on the board, because there's so many different versions of this deck. And with all 3 of these combined, or it's really 2 different versions, considered 2 different versions, and it's basically versions that play the new Rapidash versus versions that only play the old Rapidash, and we'll get into that in a minute. But it has a 10% meta share amongst all the different Rapidash decks in the game, and a 52% win rate, and has won at least one tournament, at least from the tournaments that they show us through the deck selection on their website. So let's get into these 3 different decks. So the first deck up at the top is playing one of each different Rapidash. So this is considered Ninetales Rapidash, but it's Ninetales Mythical Island Rapidash because it plays a Mythical Island Rapidash. And then the second one plays only the Mythical Island Rapidash. So the 2 first decks are actually considered within the same kind of data for Ninetales Rapidash, Mythical Island Rapidash. Whereas the third deck only plays the Genetic Apex version of Rapidash, so it's actually considered a completely different deck on Play TCG Limitless, and that version of the deck that does not play the new Rapidash only has about like a 50 to 51%, whereas any deck that plays at least one copy of the new Rapidash plays around a 52 to 53%. So when you kind of like compare and get an average between all the different decks, it's around a 52% win rate. And again, I thought this deck would be doing a lot better. It does have a huge meta share. 52% is still really good. It does obviously win tournaments, but with Blaine being able to do 70 damage with the original Rapidash, being able to do 130 with the new, 120 with the Ninetales, I really felt like this would be an amazing deck, being super duper aggressive. But again, only 52%, or at max 53% if you're talking specifically about the Mythical Island version of the deck. But let's get into these 3 different versions of the deck, and I wanted to showcase all 3 to see how these different builds look. So the first one, again, it has both different Rapidash in it, which is just a bunch of different options that you are able to play. I actually like the old Rapidash better because I truly believe that this is more of an aggro deck than anything, and you should be trying to aggro out your opponent before they can get anything set up. But when you're playing the new, because it takes 2 energy and so does your Ninetales, it is pretty beneficial to play it alongside something like a Kangaskhan, which is what this player did. They played a Kangaskhan as their 5th basic, and yes, I do believe every single one of these decks should be playing at least 5 basics, your 2 Ponyta, your 2 Vulpix, and 1 additional basic. And so that's what all 3 of these decks are doing, and they're all different basic Pokemon, and we'll get into all of them differently as we go along. So again, I think Kangaskhan actually works really well in this version of the deck, or any version of the deck that's playing the Mythical Island version of Rapidash, because it takes 2 energy, and because Ninetales takes 2 energy, and you might even want to put up 3 energy on it before you start attacking, because it does discard 1. You do want to buy some time to get those things online, and also draw in to those important Blaines, or potentially your Giovannis as well. I love playing Giovannis in this deck as well, at least the more aggressive one, which, and when I say aggressive, I mean more fast-paced one, the original Rapidash. And this deck, it does play 2 Blaines and 1 Giovanni. So that is actually probably the better version of the deck, to be completely honest. And I do believe that is the version that won the tournament that we are talking about. The deck also plays a red card. I do believe red card's actually pretty good still. And I think it's pretty good in this format as well, because there are a lot of stage 2 Pokemon in this format that also play along stage 1s in the same deck. So you can do a lot of disruption. So this is kind of like a jack of all trades version of the deck, and I really like how it was built. Now, if we move on to the next version, it's just the new Rapidash, no one of the old, with the 2 Ninetales and the 1 Magmar. So this is like a full-on Blaine's package. No Kangaskhan or Farfetch that we'll see in the next deck, and it could all be used with Blaine, which is really beneficial when you consider every single one of your Pokemon can use Blaine. However, they all do take 2 energy, so I'm not so sure I would ever. First of all, I would never play Magmar. I say this all the time in Blaine. I would never play Magmar. I understand why some people do and why this player did, but especially if you're going to be playing the Magmar, you should be playing, in my opinion, the old Rapidash, so you can at least start getting things online and start being aggressive while you build up a Magmar and or a Ninetales in the back. But again, I understand why people play it, because it works with Blaine. But let's get into the last version of the deck, and that's all the genetic Apex versions of the Rapidash being in one deck instead of the new one. And I actually like this deck a lot more. This is my favorite version of the deck. It's not because it's just the original, but because 2 Rapidash and 1 or 2 Farfetch'd in the same deck is super duper aggressive. You can get them in at the beginning of the game, and if you go first, you get to evolve into the Rapidash on your second turn and start attacking right away. If you go second, you can use your Farfetch to start attacking right away. So basically almost any single turn, whether you start first or second, you get to start attacking for 40 damage right away, potentially even 70 if you have a Blaine. So it's super beneficial, in my opinion, to be playing those cards together. So I do think all of these decks do kind of work, because they're all different builds. They all work very well with the one of extra 5th basic that you're playing them with. So I do believe they are all good versions of the deck. But with that being said, let's get into what I believe is the 5th best deck in NOEX format. So this is the next deck, and it's the Primeape, Marshadow, and Hitmonlee decks. So this is very similar to the Aerodactyl decks that we often see in the standard format, except we removed the Aerodactyls. And usually in those decks, you're either playing 2 Primeape with your Marshadow, Aerodactyl, and Hitmonlee, or 2 Farfetch'd with your Marshadow, Hitmonlee, and Aerodactyl. But in this case, because we're removing the Aerodactyls, what we're doing is we're just going full on aggro. And as you can see, this deck also has 3 different versions that all do pretty well. In fact, all 3 different versions of these run around a 55 to 56% win rate. And it all together, if you take all these decks and add them up, they have about a 3% meta share. And they've only won 1 tournament, from at least from the data that you can see right now on the website. And so let's get into the 3 different versions. The first one is actually my favorite version of all 3. Excuse me, and it's because you're playing 2 Primeape and 2 Farfetch'd. And I think anytime you can have multiple single energy attackers that do the most output without having to waste things like trainer cards, like in the Blaine's deck, having to play Blaine's. And this deck is playing Giovanni's because it is beneficial, but because you're always doing 40 or 50 damage at the beginning of the game as much as possible, even if you don't have those Giovanni's, it's still doing a tremendous amount of damage over time. And of course, you're going to be pairing it with things like Marshadow. This is why we're playing 2. And obviously, I mean, as you can see, we're only playing 1 Hitmonlee, and I agree. I don't think we should be playing 2 Hitmonlee in this format. I think 1 is good enough. And honestly, I think you can even get away with playing none. I could be wrong, but the 2 Marshadow I do believe is a must in Marshadow decks, because being able to do 100 damage on the return knockout is humongous. With Farfetch'd, again, over 2 turns, that's a minimum of 140 damage. With Primeape, that's a minimum of 150, upwards to something like 160 or even 70 if on those 2 turns you play 1 or 2 Giovanni. So this deck is super strong. It's probably the most aggressive deck in the entire format, and that's why I like it. This is one of my favorite builds. But then as we move on, as you can see, we are getting into a version of the deck that just decided to remove the Farfetch'd altogether. And so I guess what they did is they allowed themselves to be able to play some additional trainers, things like the additional Potion. In the previous deck they only played 1, in this version they're playing 2, and now they've opted to play a red card, which again, I still think red card is very valuable in this format. It allows you to just be able to mess your opponent up while being aggressive, which can be super duper beneficial, because honestly, some of the decks at the top of this list are honestly kind of scary and are like very much like the best without a doubt decks in the game, in the format, at least from what I can tell based off the data. And so you really do not want things like Golem getting online, if I'm being completely honest with you. It's probably more scarier than any standard deck that you'll ever face in standard, playing with the standard deck. Golem is extremely scary in this format. But let's get into the last version, because this is actually a really cool version as well, and it's playing both Primeape. It's playing the one from Mythical Island and the one from Genetic Apex, alongside 2 Marshadow, 2 Hitmonlee, and 1 Farfetch'd. Again, I think we could be playing 1 Hitmonlee, allowing us to play something else. But nevertheless, we are playing 2 Marshadow and 2 Primeape, and one of them being the Primeape from Genetic Apex, which is really good idea, I think, especially in this format, because now you have 3 potential Pokemon on your team that can do a minimum of 100 damage, or not a minimum, but can have the ability to be able to hit in for 100 damage, whereas in the other decks you only have 2, being the 2 Marshadow. But now, because you have 2 Marshadow and the Primeape from Genetic Apex, you have 3 Pokemon that could potentially be doing 100 points of damage in 1 turn, which I think is really good. And this has always been felt like a kind of like an options deck, a tech box deck. You're teching on all these extra one of Pokemon, often, at least in the standard format, to be able to answer anything that you may see in the current meta that you're playing. So I do like the 2 different Primeape in the same deck. But with that being said, let's get into what I believe is the 4th best deck in the NOEX format. So this is the deck I believe is the 4th best deck in the NOEX format, and it's a Tentacruel deck. That's right, Tentacruel and Greninja. So this is pretty cool. And to be honest, it has a 2% meta share with a 53% win rate, which is a bit lower than some of the decks that we saw previous to this. However, it has won 2 tournaments, so you know that it's tournament tested, and you know that it wasn't just a fluke by winning 1 tournament, because it's won more than 1 tournament. So I do believe this is the 4th best deck right now, and it plays Tentacruel, and Tentacruel has 110 HP on a stage 1 for NOEX format. That is very strong. That is Weezing level numbers of HP, so very, very tanky, and it also does a decent amount of damage. For just 2 energy, you're doing 50 damage, but you're also poisoning your Pokemon, so it automatically on your turn has a base of 60 damage, and then of course it compiles over time. As long as that Pokemon does not evolve or retreat on the following turn, it will go up to 70 to 80, 90 damage as turns go on, just because of the poison. And then of course we have the Greninja also being able to do 60 damage, and then 20 more with its own water shuriken. So damage does pile up very quickly in this deck, and we are also playing 2 Misties, so you are trying to be as aggressive as you can whilst being pretty bulky for a NOEX format. 110 and 120 on the Greninja is pretty tanky, and of course you're playing all the standard cards. You want to be able to play things like X speed. I'm actually surprised we don't see any one of Leafs in here, because Tentacruel is a 2 retreat. But maybe this deck, because we're playing Misties and the energy requirement isn't so high, you're okay with just playing X speeds and wasting a single energy for a retreat. When retreating with the Tentacruel, we are playing 1 Giovanni and 1 Sabrina. Sabrina makes sense. You have to play at least 1 in most decks, and Giovanni wants that extra bit of damage because you're already piling up damage with things like poison, like things like water shuriken. So it does play into that strat of building up additional damage other than just your original base attack. So this deck is really good. But with that being said, let's get into the next deck, the top 3 decks, and the 3rd deck that I think is the 3rd best deck in the format right now. So now we're in the top 3 decks of the format, and I don't think anyone would argue that these are the top 3. They might put them in different orders, but I do believe these are the top 3, and the first one being the Flareon, Druddigon, and Greninja deck. And as you can see, this is the exact same deck as the Gyarados EX from standard format, except we replaced the Gyarados with Flareon. So of course, when you compile damage from Druddigon and Greninja, at least 1 of each, that's already 40 damage, plus the 110 from Flareon, you're doing upwards to 100 or a minimum of 150 damage, plus more if you get additional damage from your Druddigon or additional water shuriken over time, which is really good. And because you're playing Flareon and it only requires 1 specific fire energy and 2 colorless, you're more than likely playing both water and fire in this deck, because also your Greninja only requires 1 water and 1 colorless as well. And your Druddigon, of course, requires 1 water, 1 fire, and 1 colorless, which means you have the opportunity to be able to attack with Druddigon if you need to. So this is a very good deck. It's a very strong deck. It has about a 3% meta share. It has a 56% win rate, and that 56% win rate, thank you very much, has proven its worth by winning 3 tournaments. That's right, this deck is not just a high win rate deck, but it's a high finish rate by finishing tournaments as the first place deck. So I'm very surprised to see that this only has a 3% meta share, because when you look at something like a Ninetales Rapidash deck that only has about a 52% win rate, but has a 10% meta share. And then you see this deck clearly having a better win rate and clearly winning more tournaments. It's clearly the better deck. And so I'm surprised more people aren't just switching over to these much stronger decks for tournament play to try and beat out their opponents. But this deck, again, is exact same deck as Gyarados EX, and that's why it's pretty much so strong. It has all the same benefits as Gyarados, basically being able to one-shot almost anything. However, what I will say is if you do get a one damage counter, one rough skin damage effect from your Druddigon onto something like a Golem, and then one Water Shuriken and one Flareon attack. That's only 150, so I would like to see a Giovanni in this deck if you can fit it. Maybe removing one potion or one leaf, as we have seen a lot of decks are playing one leaf, even in Druddigon builds, instead of playing two. But with that being said, let's get into the second best deck in the NOEX format. So this is the second best deck, and I think it's the second best deck by far. Not only does it have a very big meta share, but it has one of the highest win rates in the game with 57%, and it has won 3 tournaments. So the meta share, it's super popular, and it's also a popular deck that's very strong. Unlike, again, the Blaine's deck that has a 10% but a low win rate, this has a high meta share and a high win rate and a very high finish rate, winning 3 tournaments. And I'm sure it's won more, but again, when you're looking at Play Limitless TCG, there are only certain, when you click on a deck to see what tournaments it has won, there might only be a select few that pop up in that section, and that's the data I was looking at. So this is the data I am using. But again, where else am I going to get the data from if not Play Limitless TCG? So again, 7% win meta share, 57% win rate, and 3 tournament wins from what we can tell. And this is the standard superior Exeggutor deck, except it's not playing Celebi, and instead of obviously playing EX Pokemon, the EX version, because it's not no EX, you're playing the one from Mythical Island, because again, there are a lot of Pokemon in this game, or in this format, that do play a lot of energy. So this will be one-shotting a lot of stuff as well. We're also playing one Delmise, because with one energy, you're basically going to be doing, or with 2 energy, sorry, you're going to be able to do upwards of 90 damage, which is super duper strong. And then you're obviously going to be playing Ericas because you want to be able to heal. There are, of course, Pokemon that could one-shot you with your Exeggutor, but they're few and far between. So the only ones that can really do it is a Melmetal and a Golem with a Giovanni or a Flareon. So there aren't so many cards that can knock you out, and this deck might just knock you out before it knocks, before you knock them out. And you can do a ton of healing, because again, you're not just playing Ericas, but you're also playing potions, and then you're playing a one of a leaf, so you don't waste any energies, and you're playing obviously one Sabrina, 2 Professor's Research, and 2 Pokeball. Come on, obviously, but the one Sabrina, of course. And this deck is super duper strong, and I'm not surprised either. It's super strong. The version of this in EX with Celebi is super strong. It has one of the highest win rates in Standard, and it has one of the higher rates in the NOEX format, so I'm not surprised at all. But now let's get into the number 1 deck in the NOEX, and ladies and gentlemen, guess who it is? Golem. So this is the number 1 deck in the meta for the NOEX format, and it's the one deck we all saw pop up in Standard format as winning the Ursi Day. I think it was the 17 or 1800 player tournament in Standard format. It's Golem Druddigon. That's right, Golem Druddigon, super duper good. Way better in this format than it is in standard. It did win one of the biggest tournaments of all time in the Ursi Day tournament. However, ever since it won, it basically completely dropped in win rate in the standard format, and is just not that good in standard. However, in NOEX, it is without a doubt the most powerful deck of all time. 21% meta share amongst a ton of different Golem variants, all with very high and good win rates. The total win rate amongst all decks compiled for Golem is 56% win rate, and they won a total of or at least a minimum of 9 tournaments. This deck, without a doubt, is the best deck in NOEX, and I don't think anyone can prove me wrong, at least not the data. But we have 2 decks up on this list, up on this screen, and we're going to talk about both of them. And one of them is, of course, the Golem Druddigon deck with 1 Marshadow, 1 Hitmonlee, just like we see in standard. But then we also have a Golem Chatot deck, and this Golem Chatot deck won one of these 9 tournaments, and it is it runs, that specific version runs about a 61% win rate. So that is a very strong deck. It's that part of the meta share is very low out of all Golem decks, but that is obviously a very strong version of the deck. Obviously, you're trying to start the game out with your Chatot. You're playing a ton of fossils, as you can see, which is a super common strat in Chatot decks, because you get to just put all those fossils down. You don't need them. You're not evolving into anything, and you're just discarding them to get your hand space super duper free. And then you refill your hand and get all those pieces that you need. You get all those evolution stages. You get those Brocks in your hand when you absolutely need them, so that you can play on curve, because if you don't know, Golem has pretty much a perfect curve. Your Geodude will be able to attack with 1 energy, your Graveler will be able to attack with 2, and your Golem will be able to attack with 3 plus an additional energy that you get from the Brock. So it is pretty important to be able to get those combo pieces in your hand with your Chatot. So that deck is really cool and really interesting. And then, of course, we have the standard build. It's the 2 Golem, the 2 Druddigon, the 1 Marshadow, and 1 Hitmonlee with the 2 Brock as well. The 2 Leaf, of course, because you need to be able to retreat the Druddigon out to get that Golem in once you have it online. And once you have it online, and this is why it's so strong, it has 160 HP. I believe it's I want to say it has the most HP out of all non-EX Pokemon, to be completely honest. I can't remember what the Venusaur has, but I'm pretty sure 160 is the highest. And then it does 120 damage, which is super duper strong. If you have the Giovanni, which this deck, as you can see, plays 1 copy of, and I agree with that. I think you should be playing at least 1 Golem in this deck to get those 130 point breakpoints. But once it's online, not only does it have 160 HP, but once it attacks, it takes 60 less damage from attacks, which means basically nothing is ever going to one-shot this once it attacks, and it most likely won't even two-shot it once it attacks, because it has so much HP, it has so much like effect minus your attack damage effect kind of thing going on, and you're also playing potions, so you're able to heal it up as well while you're doing this. This deck is just way too strong, and I don't see how this deck will ever come out of the meta unless in the next sets we get a ton of very strong NOEX Pokemon to help this meta out from getting Golem out of the meta. But that's probably why, one of the reasons why Exeggutor, because Exeggutor is already a very good deck, but it probably gets even better when at the top of the meta, you have a deck that is weak, like Golem, weak to grass type. It also has the biggest meta share, so you're going to see it more often than not, and so therefore you have a super duper type advantage. And even if you are seeing a lot of Blaine and Flareon, you might still be doing just way better. And as you can see, Exeggutors are still doing way better than every other deck except for this deck. Even with a lot of fire in the meta, because again, the Blaine's deck is about a 10%, Flareon is about a 3%, so there's about a total of 13% fire decks in the meta right now for NOEX, but Exeggutor is running into its type advantage more than its type disadvantage, so it's going to do very well in this meta. But anyways, with that being said, that's it for the NOEX top 10 decks. I hope you liked it. Leave a comment in the comment section below, like, subscribe, and share. Join up in my Discord so when trading comes out, we can all trade cards together. And as always, keep cooking.